how we conceptualize what PTSD is. Well, we think of fear as being the core emotion. If you did not have criterion A in the PTSD diagnosis, then I think you could make the argument that fear isn't necessary. I can tell you that there's a lot of good examples of how you can have all the symptoms and not have fear. If you've ever administered a PTSD checklist or some kind of inventory, and maybe you've gotten rushed, like I have, and you forgot to tell the person filling it out that only fill this out about these experiences and describe what criterion A is. I've gotten those forms back, and they've been filled out, circled the most extreme responses all the way down. And I look at it and say, my God, this guy's been, he must have some serious traumas. And then I ask him, well, what did you think about? And I've had this happen more than once, and that would say, well, my divorce. This is tearing me apart. And so we would work in therapy on that, and the PTSD would be secondary to it. PTSD is not always the main issue, but because we throw in criteria A, what we're saying then is issues like divorce and adjustment back home are not necessarily what we're going to focus on. Fear has to be the basis of what we're working on. That's what criteria A does for us. So the core emotion of PTSD then becomes fear because of criteria A. And then we define this as just having a single salient event. A single traumatic event happens. Also, another thing you may not think about is that the trauma is often an outlier from our everyday experience. And this is not a specific criteria in PTSD, but it's an implicit criteria. If you think about diagnosing somebody, if you've ever met with a patient that's difficult to diagnose, you're like, you're kind of on the borderline, and this can happen with criteria A. You can say, you have all the symptoms, but I'm not quite sure if the event you went through would exactly be a criterion A event. Was it, and it might seem obvious, but let me give you some examples of how this can come up. I was working with a vet who worked on a flight deck, and he wasn't knocked off the deck, he wasn't almost blown off and caught by a net, but he worked on the flight deck, and he was like, I could have died at any time. He did not have any single encounter where he was almost killed, though. He didn't see somebody killed. But in his own mind, he thought, this is, yeah, I could have been killed. And he had all the symptoms of PTSD. And so then drawing the line into, is that the normal routine of somebody who's on a flight deck crew? Is that the normal experience? Should that qualify him? Well, then if we qualify him, then I think we just have to say being on a flight deck in and of itself is sufficient to have PTSD. In that case, I had to say no, it didn't meet the criteria. If he had had a close call, it might have been clearer. Now, in my personal feeling, he had all the symptoms. He's suffering from it, so we just went ahead and treated him, but he was interested in trying to get compensation for this. So I had to tell him that you're not going to meet the criteria, and when you go to get evaluated for this, it's going to be a difficult sell for you to get this. And he was turned down. But he certainly had a lot of distress and suffering as a result of this. But think of police officers, if somebody comes in and just in the normal line of duty, without necessarily being fired at, said, well, my life was in danger, would we say that person has a criterion A event? Probably not. Something would need to stand out. Now, if you or I'm assuming you're not police officers, but if you or I were to go through some of those experiences, that might be more out of the ordinary from us, and we would say, okay, we're more likely to be traumatized. We come to the scene of an accident. We're not paramedics. We're not trained for that. It might be more outstanding for us, more salient. So the more salient the experience is, the easier it is to recognize that this is a criteria A event. It has to be something out of the ordinary. Sexual assault, for example, is easily diagnosed because of that, something completely out of the ordinary. And then we think about the trauma as making us a victim or a survivor. And again, it's nothing that's stated in the criteria for PTSD, but it's implied that we're surviving this traumatic event. And let's talk a little bit then about how that shapes the way we do treatment typically. And then I'll talk about some of the complexities of combat, some of the ways that this model of conceptualizing PTSD may not exactly fit with combat experiences. So, how many of you are familiar with prolonged exposure therapy or cognitive processing therapy or CBT for PTSD? So some of you, some not. Okay, so I'll describe a little bit about that to give you an idea. So in prolonged exposure therapy, which is the most popular therapy in the VA for PTSD, and one that has been researched most heavily, we're going to pick a single incident to focus on in our therapy, a single traumatic event. What's the most traumatic event you have? Kind of following that model that PTSD is based on a single traumatic event, we should be able to pick one out and easily identify what's the worst one. And then we're going to have the vet talk about that experience, and in talking about it, confronting their fear. So we want them to engage with that emotion, so the vet's going to close their eyes and then talk in the present tense as if they're living that experience again. I am doing this, I am approaching this small village, I see this, I do this, as if you're trying to replay it in the moment and get that individual as engaged as possible. And the idea behind that is that if we can help the vet to confront their fear, they can help work through that memory, help process it, stop avoiding it, be able to think about it without being re-traumatized, without reliving that experience again. We do this behaviorally as well. So in addition to doing a narrative about the experience, we're also going to have the vet behaviorally approach things they've been avoiding and build a small hierarchy. So with vets who have difficulty going to public places, which is just so many of them, we might have them go to a store that they go. Often they say Walmart. I don't know how much business I give to Walmart. I feel terrible. But just when I ask them where they want to go, they're just like Walmart's in their area. There's no local stores.
It's a war zone there.
And so they often, if you want to go to Walmart at 3 a.m. at night, then that's a good time to start and stay there for a certain amount of time. What's the idea? The idea behind that is to stay long enough to bring your fear out and then to eventually extinguish it, to confront what you've been avoiding, and do it in a moderate way. And then gradually, as they get more comfortable, they can go to other places at busier times, maybe Walmart on a Saturday afternoon. That's a tough one. I have trouble with that too. I hope none of my vets see me at Walmart, when I'm trying to rush through. What I tell them, don't rush through, just stay there a little longer. But the idea behind it is that we're confronting this experience. We're not going to avoid it. We're going to engage with it. Another part of the treatment is that we're going to work on maladaptive thoughts, maladaptive beliefs. If this is something that has come out of the ordinary, this is a traumatic experience that has disrupted your normal way of life, you develop maladaptive perspectives because of that. The world's not a safe place. The world isn't. The world is full of evil people. It's disrupted your normal sense of self, and we're trying to bring that back into alignment. We're trying to make this so that you can get back to life as normal. And then, if you are a victim of this traumatic event, or a survivor, if you will, then you may feel powerless. And confronting these things is going to give you a sense of initiative, going to give you a sense of control that you may have been lacking. And again, these are ideas that are implicit in the definition of PTSD and treatments that are based on that definition. And PE is very much a treatment that targets the symptoms of PTSD. And if we think about whether it's CPT or PE or EMDR or CBT for PTSD or interpersonal therapy, these treatments are more and more being shaped to fit the specific diagnosis and shaped to treat the specific symptoms. So the diagnosis is really affecting what kind of treatments we're observing. So there is a connection between between treatment and diagnostic criteria. And the idea behind, that's the idea behind evidence-based medicine. We need to adapt our treatments to fit. We need to mold what treatment we're doing to fit the disorder we're trying to treat. And when we change the definition of a disorder, we can sometimes change the treatments that we have. Now, I want you to think about some of the complexities of combat. So I want to, some ways that the idea of combat doesn't exactly fit with this model of PTSD, this way of thinking about it. And one is that a typical model, I think, of PTSD might fit a single sexual assault. That fits the model, the diagnostic criteria of PTSD very well. Combat could fit certain aspects of it, but I think there's ways that it doesn't fit, and I want to highlight those because I want you to start thinking about these ideas from a broader perspective, beyond just the diagnostic criteria. I mean, PTSD is more than just what the diagnostic criteria says. In combat exposure, we're often seeing things, guilt and shame. Those are certainly part of the definition of PTSD now, but there are only two small items buried down. You don't have to endorse those items. You can have PTSD without endorsing any guilt or shame. But in combat experiences, sometimes there's more of that. Sense of meaninglessness is often more often the case. Why was I involved in this? What did this mean? Did this conflict result in any change, any difference in the world? And that's often the case because in combat you're a participant. In an assault, you're not a participant. You're not a willing participant in that experience. But in combat, part of what you're doing is it's your will to be there, your mission to be there. So there's more purpose woven into the idea of combat than there is to just an assault. The second idea is that the single salient event defines this. And in combat, it's often the case that no one trauma may stand out above the dangers of war. It's not uncommon to work with a vet and do an assessment and ask them, what is it that really stands out? What really bothers you about your deployment? What happened that really disturbed you? And they'll sit there and they'll just say, one or two things. I don't know. I mean, just so much stuff. I can't pick it. And to kind of ask them to do that is difficult. It may not fit with their experience because they have so many traumatic experiences, especially people who have 1, 2, 3, 4 deployments. That is so common. But then, on the other hand, for vets who may not have been directly engaged in combat, meaning they didn't fire their weapon at the enemy, but they were in a combat zone. I mean, they're in Iraq and Afghanistan doing missions. They'll say, nothing happened to me, nothing traumatic happened. I didn't, and so I'll just do a little more questioning, a little more investigation and ask them, well, was your base ever mortared? Well, yeah, but it never hit us. I mean, there's never hit in the base. Okay, so it doesn't count, right? No, it does count. I mean, was it possible that they could? Yeah, I guess it was possible. Well, we were driving convoys, but we never hit an IED. Well, was it the possibility of being IEDs in the area? Was that a real possibility where you were? Well, yeah, we were always on the lookout for IEDs. So it's, for some vets, those kind of experiences just seem every day. They don't see them as traumatic. They just see them as part of the whole experience of war, and that's a real difference. You're living in a situation. The trauma isn't an outlier from every day. The trauma is an outlier in our typical model. And if we think about combat, the trauma is just part of what you're doing. You live there. You're living in a combat zone. It's a different experience. If you're assaulted, you can go home. You can get support from your family. You can find your own refuge. In a combat zone, you just have to pick up and move back and go back into the situation. You are living in, I don't want to call it a traumatic setting, but you're living in a setting that is dangerous. That is day in and day out, what your life is like. So the amount of exposure to trauma is so much more. And it's not just in terms of isolated traumatic events, but just the entire atmosphere. And you can work with lots of vets who have never had direct combat exposure, who's got severe symptoms of PTSD, severe symptoms, difficulty getting back home and adjusting. And then finally, we think of the person as a survivor, as a victim of a traumatic event. It's more complicated in combat. You are not only a victim, but you can also be a perpetrator of violence as well. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide, because it brings up an issue that is often, that's gaining more popularity, and is a way that we want you to think more beyond PTSD just as a fear-based disorder, but a disorder of existential issues, and this is moral injury. The idea of moral injury is often thought about as, when we think about being in a combat zone, sometimes requires you, forces you to perpetrate violence on others, and forces you to do things you would never do otherwise. Litz and his colleagues, 2009, there's a really great article. If you look up that name, you can find a 2009 article that details all of this in great depth. And I won't go through all that research, but I want to talk about this idea from an existential perspective. But the idea of this is that it was developed because clinicians focused most of their attention on the impact of life-threatening traumas. The idea of fear is what we're talking about, and failing to pay sufficient attention to the impact of events with moral and ethical implications, events that provoke shame and guilt. And the argument is that moral injury involves an act of transgressing that creates dissonance and conflict because it violates a person's basic assumptions and beliefs about right and wrong and personal goodness. And it's not hard to see why we can have moral conflict in combat situations, and why it's so prevalent amongst many of our returning troops that they have this moral injury inside of them. From more of a cultural perspective, we have to look at how our society is today and how it was many years ago. I mean, I think we often look at our service members and think, these are warriors. These are people who are, trained in this. These are people who, have been highly specialized set of skills. And in one sense, I can totally agree with that. In another sense, I think that view can distort the trauma that people go through. That we can brush it off and just say, well, they're warriors, they can deal with that, they've been trained for that. I couldn't deal with it, but they can deal with that.
I had an individual that the only way I could get this person to make that understanding of that moral injury, and I don't know if I can reject this, but basically I used the example of in the home base, we have separation of church and state, and now it's becoming more and more prevalent in that we don't say amen in school, and we don't have prayers before a game and all this stuff. But over there in the military, we still have the clergy beside us. The clergy's back there at the base ready to pray for me to go out and kill someone. And there's that dichotomy of I'm being blessed to take a life, where at home I would be condemned for even praying in public. And this helped that person. It helped him put that together.
I think there is a great dichotomy between what are the ethics in combat and at home, and there has to be. I mean, it cannot be the same set of rules you operate by. If we think about, if you want to take perspective about in our modern society, regardless of what you think the crime rates are, how violent it's getting, it is much better than it was hundreds of years ago. The rate of violence, your likelihood of being killed by murder is far less, several times less than what it was. In fact, if you look back in medieval times, Barbara Hannawalt, who's a professor of medieval studies at University of Minnesota, talked about how did people in medieval times die? Was it that there was these armed conflicts and wars between armed factions? No, it was often quarrels between farmers, quarrels over issues of honor. So you would be killed for an everyday incident, offending somebody's honor, defiling their family name. Violence was a much more accepted part of society back then. Not to say that it wasn't traumatic for them, but it was much more accepted. Now, let me give you another example going back just a couple hundred years. Does anybody have a $10 bill on them? So search your. So here's a $10 bill here. So here's a $10 bill. They didn't pay me well, so I'm just going to take this. No. So do you know who's on the $10 bill? Yeah. So he was, contrary to what people thought, he was not a president. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury. Do you know how he died? He was killed in a duel. The first Secretary of the Treasury, okay? So if we think about today, and he had a dispute with Aaron Burr, who was the sitting vice president at the time. They had been at each other for many years, for decades, trying to undermine each other's political careers, publicly criticizing them. They finally reached a point in 1804 where Hamilton had put out a journalistic attack on Burr. And whether he meant to send it just to a few friends or not, it got leaked and it got published in papers and widely distributed while Burr was trying to run for political office, the governor of New York, if I remember correctly. And this was the final rift. That was it. The two men had finally built up enough animosity where they decided to settle their disputes by a duel. They found a secret location, went off, and they had their guns. Hamilton was the first one to fire, and you should know in duels, it wasn't always the case that they tried to kill each other. Many duels ended where no one was shot. Many people walked away. It was kind of a right of honor. If somebody offended you, you could challenge them to a duel. And in fact, it was so much the case that in the early 1800s, states were, more northern states, but many states were starting to outlaw because it was such a common way of settling disputes. I mean, can you imagine today? Can you imagine this? I mean, think of these figures in society today. We're not talking about lowlifes here. We're talking about people who are not only important in their time, but historical figures who have shaped American society, settling their disputes through a duel. I mean, if that doesn't show you how accepted violence is at that point in time and how much things have changed. But what happened is Hamilton fired long and wide and missed. We don't know if he did it intentionally or not. What we do know is that Burr did not intend to miss, and he landed a solid shot, hit Hamilton, and the next day he died from that gunshot wound. Now, what happened with Burr? He was charged and acquitted. So he served no jail time for this, but he was condemned for killing Hamilton, and it did ruin his political career. But nonetheless, it shows you how much our society has changed, where we are. Our acceptance of violence, our way of growing up, our way of living is so different from where it was before. Violence is not accepted. And so for many of us to be placed in a combat situation, despite our training, goes against our basic enculturation, our basic process. And many service members come back conflicted about what they had to do, knowing that I had to do this, knowing that if I did not kill, I would have been killed, others would have been killed, but something doesn't quite fit with them. And that's the idea of moral injury. There are, if you think about what service members are going through, so one survey taken 2003-2004, service members found that 65% of those surveyed saw dead bodies or human remains. 31% reported handling or uncovering human remains. 60% reported having seen ill or wounded women or children who they were unable to help. Those are just the ones that were unable to help. So, exposure to violence in a combat situation is just part of what you have to deal with. It is inescapable in a combat situation. Often the burden, we think of our service members as serving our country, but in some ways we think about them also as having some personal responsibility. I think this is my best explanation. Why did we attack service members from Vietnam? Why did we blame them? Why did we protest against them? In some ways it makes no sense, but I think the only explanation is that we somehow attribute to them responsibility that we don't attribute to others. Sebastian Junger, who's a war journalist, written several good books on deployment, made a film, Restrepo, where he went to Afghanistan and stayed in an outpost for a year. Great, amazing film if you haven't seen it. Kind of disturbing as well. He says that in an op-ed that the growing cultural gap between American society and our military is dangerous and unhealthy. The sense that war belongs exclusively to soldiers and generals may be one of the most destructive expressions of this gap. Both sides are to blame, meaning liberals and Democrats. It doesn't matter what your party affiliation is. I know soldiers who don't want to be called heroes, a grossly misused term, or told that they did their duty. Some don't want to be thanked. Soldiers know all too well how much killing, mostly of civilians, goes on in war. Congratulating them makes them feel that people back home have no idea what happened when a human body encounters the machinery of war. I think the more that we put this burden on our vets, the more that we make this an idea that war belongs to them, the more that they take those on, the more they feel the moral consequences. Why did they not just come back and say, well, this is just what I had to do, I just had to do my duty? Because they feel a personal responsibility for their actions. If this means we need to change how we deal with our veterans, I think it does. I think we need to, as a society, deal and take more responsibility for this. If you look at the coverage of the war, when it started, it was nonstop and sensationalistic, not truly focused on what the war was about or about the experiences of service members, but more about how big a missile we can build. And as the war went on, coverage went less and less and less and less and less, and now it's just a matter of fact. People are dying in this conflict. And I think it's because we're saying that's there. The military is taking care of that. It's not us. But I think and I think what Sebastian Junger is saying is that we all bear a responsibility for this. And when our vets come back home and they feel that this is their own war, they carry those burdens with them. Are we treating our veterans as warriors? Are we treating them as a class of society? Warriors is a social class in a society that carry that term throughout their life. In tribal cultures, there is a warrior class. They're treated like that. They're respected. When they come back home, vets are often treated like just other people. We certainly thank them and honor them in certain ways, but they're not a warrior class. And so I think that responsibility falls back on them. And I think that the weight of war weighs on them more than what it should. And it should weigh far more on us. But there are other reasons as well for moral injury. In our modern wars, Andrew Bacevich has said something. He was a colonel, and he's written several good books about looking at American society. He said, America can win any war that the enemy wants to fight on our terms. And if you think about Desert Storm, boy, that was a war fought on our terms. That was a war that was great. The wars now are not fought that way. The enemy is not going to fight us on our terms. They're going to use their native advantage. They're going to take advantage of their resources, which is that this is their home, they know it. And they're not going to fight a conventional war. And so what we see is more insurgent tactics being used where you blend into the populace. You make sure you never know who will attack you. You use unconventional enemy combatants. It's very common to hear vets talk about being attacked by children or women, elderly. Sometimes these are not even willing participants or knowing participants, but just incidental participants. Children carrying weapons over to grenades or explosives. A family vehicle having explosives in it, driving to a checkpoint. Did the whole family know? Who knows? In some cases, I bet probably not. But those facts that we have to fight, and often we don't know who the enemy is, means that sometimes we're not thinking in terms of the enemy as being children or women. That doesn't fit our stereotype of who an enemy combatant is. And so for us for veterans to have to go through that to survive, they have to fight against those individuals. And it creates a moral conflict. I mean, that's not who we think of violence from. I think if you were to imagine a stereotype of a violent person in your mind, probably the last person you would think of is a small child. But that's what our veterans are being faced with. And it creates a moral conflict. And being in a combat zone long enough, it's not possible, I think, to be in combat without having accidents, without collateral damage. And that's the whole point. That's what the war is about. That's intentional. They don't want to be out in the open. So it really, there are a lot of situations that create moral injury. But there's another scenario that comes up, and I think that this is an example of where we might say, well, this is just an individual who is a defective moral character, but retaliation that we've heard several incidents of that, where veterans have retaliated against the locals and to get back at them. One story I heard as a veteran who was in Vietnam told me that his platoon was attacked, was mortared and sniped, and they lost several people. So they went into the local villages and they were pissed off. And they were going to find out who was communicating with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, who was communicating the locations, and who was part of the North Vietnamese hiding inside those villages. And everybody denied it. So what they did is they lined up the water buffalo. Water buffalo is just like a size of an ox, and in Vietnam it's used to plow fields, to transport heavy items a long distance, to ride. It's a valuable, very valuable part of their society, and important, probably the most important part of their agricultural process. And sometimes they even think of these things as pets. And they lined up the water buffalo and shot them. There was no threat to them at that point. It was just for retaliation. And this individual was, very disturbed by what he did. Very disturbed, because in that situation, that made sense. And in that moment, that made sense. But now back at home, that doesn't make sense. And it's a moral injury that he carries, and we worked quite a bit to help him deal with that. So let me take a look at how.
I think you have about 3 minutes, Jason.
Okay, wow. Well, yeah, I got everything I need to. So let me touch on a few other existential issues, which is, not just morality, but also, was the war justified? Questions about what your service meant. Did the war make any difference? Were we put in unnecessary danger? Did our leadership put us in harm's way unnecessarily, either because of incompetence or because of ulterior motives? And those kind of questions, these existential questions, then shape how you look at your traumas. You have these combat traumas, but think about it. You have a traumatic event, you've lost somebody, but then if you're also thinking on top of that, that person died for no reason. Just a few days ago, I had that was his issue. 58,000 people in Vietnam. Why did they have to die? It didn't make any sense. If you could find a sense of purpose in that, then not that those traumas wouldn't be difficult and hard to deal with, but that those would be probably more tolerable. But when you put it through this lens where things don't feel meaningful, it changes, it makes those events more traumatic. And I think to work through the traumas, we have to grapple with these existential issues. And let me go to my last slide here. A few questions you can start exploring with veterans. Some of the broader issues about their perceptions of their service. How do they think about it? What are their attitudes towards their service? How do those attitudes change over time? And you might see if you have vets who've been deployed multiple times, they often will have a change of attitude from the first to the second to the third deployment. When you're dealing with these issues, I think the idea is acknowledgement and validation. Don't come in there and try to challenge away or make somebody rational in terms of, you shouldn't feel that what you did was, that it was all meaningless. You've made a difference. I think the idea is that we have to acknowledge and allow them to come to a sense of meaning in their own understanding. We can't just challenge this like an irrational belief. We have to help them find meaning at a personal level. It is often difficult to find meaning in larger issues in terms of the war as a whole, but maybe at a personal level, your missions, the people you worked with, you can find meaning at that level sometimes. You can find meaning in terms of the difference you made. Maybe the war didn't make a difference, and that's something that we're not going to change in your eyes, but maybe in your own actions, what did that mean? Your day-to-day experiences, what difference did you make there? What sense of camaraderie did you have? And then finding meaning back home, because this often affects veterans in their lives back at home. The rate of divorce is so much higher in veterans. Family disruption, being separated from one family. Impaired functioning, not being able to find work and struggling with that. In fitting back into the civilian world, feeling that you're changed and different, and because of those experiences, having a different mindset. I'll just jump to the conclusion. And, if there's a point to this talk, it's that the way we have to look at war, the effects of war, it reshapes our veterans' experiences and their understanding of the world and themselves. There will never be a return to life before deployment, because this asks them to forget their experiences, to forget their sacrifices, to ask them just to go back to life as normal, and that's not appropriate. If we want to help our veterans heal from the traumas of war, we have to help them make sense of what often doesn't make sense, and find meaning in their lives today. Thank you.
Well, you've all been extremely patient holding on to those questions, so now we have some time for you to ask them, and if you need to leave, again, I ask you to fill out your evaluation. There's a box outside on the table. You can drop it in. But I'd like to open it up for questions for our presenters.
For anybody. I noticed one thing. I left the VA a little over a year ago, and I noticed one thing was going to change in the DSM. As I was leaving, I wondered how it would play out, and now it's playing out. There's a criteria now that extends to people that were put in prolonged periods of trauma, potential trauma. So in my mind, I'm thinking, wow, that's going to open up claims for like veterans put back to Korea. Because if you were in a ship that didn't get hit and nothing happened to it, but you were feeling scared the whole time, you might qualify for that criteria A now. Or if you're a NOM and your next step could be a sniper or a mine, you meet criteria A now. Have you seen how's the VA dealing with that?
I get a lot of guys come to me because I'm one of the veterans and a doctor who thinks I'm not in the competent process, and as taxpayers, you should be glad of that because I'd be way too easy with money. But we're not seeing the surge. I'm not seeing a surge of people coming. I get kind of a steady, same flow, and the folks who are either looking rightfully or because they're scamming the system and they want a free lunch, they're not researching the DSM-5 very well, so if you're worried about a lot of scam artists out there, tell them they need to train up better because they're doing a lousy job of it.
Well, I
It
think
means,
also,
I'm still noticing more people are not getting the competent pen. You probably observe it. I'm with Jason on this one. If they've got all the symptoms, you know, if it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, and it gets better when you treat it like a duck, for God's sakes, call it a duck. You know, it's not a hard one. There are people in the same unit, through the same experiences, and some of them will get PTSD and some of them will not. It amazes me. Because it, you know, you think, because it's some fairly impressive stuff, you get the same results, but you don't always, and it tells you that genetics and individual backgrounds and everything else count. So it's not caused the surge, and maybe people, the scam artists just are behind the eight ball and trying to research the area, but doesn't, I'm not seeing the surge of people coming in demanding, hey, can you get them to give me competent pen money, can you get them to give me the PTSD cash? I'm getting the same group of folks who come in with that, some of them with good claims, some of them who are just looking for some more booze money.
and I didn't mean to imply that somebody who had spent a year in Nam was a scam artist. It's just, it
There
seems
are, there are a few,
yeah, sure.
but
There are.
less than the popular press, and less than what people worry about. Yes, ma'am.
I would say maybe 5 to 7 years ago, when I first was looking for the opportunity to work with veterans, I found it very difficult to get a foot in the door because I'm old and I'm a woman, I'm not a vet. So can you speak to how the VA or the veterans as a population are more receptive to non-veterans working with them? Has it gotten better? Are they more receptive, less receptive?
The guys who haven't come in from the guys who haven't come in from the dark, they're still out there in the woods and every now and put their head up and give the VA a chance with the general direction. Boy, they're still pretty sure that the only person who can understand what happened is a fellow vet. And it's really tough to get credibility. And I see a lot of these guys and I tell them, I've got good folks here, some of them veterans. Some of them want to be honorary veterans because they've done so much of this work, they're carrying the same sort of weight. And I submit to you that these guys, having shared all this experience and helped so many people out of the jungle, the PTSD, they've gotten pretty used to the jungle, and the jungle's gotten used to them. So it ought to count, and that's kind of the speech that I have with some of those guys, and it's met with skepticism, of course, but hopefully I've been able to help turn some people around and get them to be willing to give us a chance.
I used to say, so does that mean if you're gonna have heart surgery, your heart surgeon had to have had heart surgery? You know, just as a
The
segue.
comparison with this one was accepted.
Oh, yeah, but I think
I
that's a
get
lot
plenty of
of,
heart guys who think, I wish my surgeon had been through this experience so they'd been less of a bastard, yeah.
I found that the acceptance has been great. When I first started 5 years ago, I was afraid that I was gonna be thrown out of the room. They were gonna look at me and say, well, you know, how can you understand anything we went through? But I really found them to be greatly appreciative of the help and open, willing to talk about their experiences, and I think it's more on a personal level, if they respect you, then they're gonna be open and work with you. And I think you also have to respect their experiences. If they want to say, I wanna work with just a vet, we say, there's a few vets here. You can try me in the meantime, and if you don't like me, then, you know, you can work with this other vet, I'm happy to, or you can go right now, but it'll be a little bit of a wait to get to that new provider, and kind of, okay, I'll just stick with you. And I found them to be very open and accepting, and very rarely, you know, just kind of count on one hand the number of times people didn't want to work with me because I wasn't a vet. And so I've been really grateful for that. It sure has made working there a lot better.
Is there a gender bias with veterans? Because I was talking to somebody at the VA, they were very excited to hear one of our offices has 3 male therapists. We've got a whole slew of really good female therapists as well, and they could help. So I'm wondering, is that going to be an obstacle?
I think one thing, I don't see it as quite as big of an obstacle, but I think that there's also a selection bias that people who are likely to come get mental health treatment are more open to, getting help from a male or a female, from a veteran and non-veteran. I think the people who probably have the staunchest and most rigid attitudes probably are not making it to our department. But the people we see, sure, they're open, but that's a select population. And there are some veterans who will request a female therapist because they feel like men can't understand them, and some who request a male therapist. And it's not just female therapists requesting female, sometimes a male vet will request a female therapist.
And an additional comment is that when I came on, I was unsure how it would work, or even if I'd like working with vets. And military culture seems to involve collaboration, and that you had each other's back. And I found that the vets readily affiliated in therapy, and you might find them more accommodating than the average clients. I really like working with vets today, and can't see myself anywhere else.
They're used to a military that says, you'll go see this person for your medical needs, you'll have them take care of your medical needs, and you will like it, by God. Then you'll go to the unit function, and you will have fun there for precisely the hour that it exists. Very helpful to help people avoid the problems with free choice.
Question in the back there.
Yeah, MST didn't come up at all. They kind of surprised me because that's kind of a trauma, both male and female veterans.
Well, that certainly is a problem. I don't think that that's to say that that issue isn't concerning and alarming and something that needs help. I think that the number of trauma that vets go through is so broad, you just can't fit everything in. But there is a lot of attention being given to that, and a lot of good work that's being done. I think the ideas that, at least the ideas I've been talking about, apply. Some of these ideas of existential issues can apply to military sexual trauma as well, in terms of how it affects your view of the world. If you've been sexually assaulted by somebody who is supposed to be a person there who is supporting you, who is, you're depending on, my God, how can you ever depend on that, feel safe in a combat situation? So, issues of military sexual assault certainly affect existential issues and adjustment. And it is an unfortunately all too common issue that we see quite a bit, both with males and with females as well. And
Interestingly enough, at the same time this is going on, the IPSC, Iowa Psychiatric Society, is putting on their kind of yearly thing, and this year it's on PTSD, and one of my best students is doing a presentation on military sexual trauma research she's doing there. Another person who is presenting there. So you went to the wrong venue today. You've got more of that with the psychiatrists, and we're obnoxious, who occasionally have some use, but a lot of work's being done along those lines. But it's exactly the sense of betrayal that goes along with military sexual assault, both male and female, is profound, and it really complicates the picture. And you got to be very careful not to come across as an authority figure, because what they've learned is that authority figures, and the closer you get, the more likely and more dangerous you are, the more likely you are to be betrayed. So it is extraordinarily tricky. You really have to find the right measure of pushing and not pushing at certain times to not trigger all the dangerous responses. So it is extraordinarily challenging in those cases, and not for the faint-hearted.
Jeffrey, how are we doing on time?
You're great.
There was a question in the back.
Yeah, do any of you have experience with neurofeedback and down-regulating some of this intensity that these guys and women are managing?
Only a little bit from my training up at the Mayo Clinic.
Yeah.
It's done for a variety of things up there. We have to help people do it with PTSD, and it can be effective. What was nice about it, for me, PTSD is all about feeling powerless in difficult situations, not having a sense of control in the most difficult situations, and people's brains are built to kind of figure that out. We don't like powerlessness, and certainly the group that volunteers for the Army doesn't volunteer because they want to feel powerless. This gives you a sense of control. Again, it's really helpful. That's why I find the mindfulness training that I send extraordinary number of patients that Dr. Carl and Dr. Mulaney here for is powerful because it gives them that sense of control. I don't emphasize the Buddhist words, I don't emphasize the, I call it brain trimming, and I say, this will give you the keys to your emotional car again. And that seems to be, I'm surprised, because my guys hate mumbo jumbo, they hate psychiatry, they hate psychology, they don't want to be involved.
Not all of them hate, they hate psychiatry, but not psychology.
Which is as it should be, but this really goes, because again, you can't get them to take the damn meds, so you guys have to do the heavy lifting.
I was thinking, I don't know a whole lot about it, except, you know, as a guy who does mindfulness, I'd like to learn more. But Bessel van der Kolk commented at a conference a while back that he's getting interested in it because some will have impaired prefrontal lobe functioning. He says, but if you look at their brains, you know, what you're seeing is a storm over on the one side. And if you could find a way to train that to cool down, you might bypass some of the impairment, you know, pre-existing. So I can't say whether prolonged mindfulness might enhance that prefrontal functioning, because that's what it's known to do, is, you know, as much as 30-fold.
I think they're similar. I think neurofeedback and meditation are working with the same
Yeah.
alpha theta waves, you know, and trying to downregulate. I just wonder
I
if you're
agree.
actually using it yet.
And you see the same synchrony in like the high amplitude gamma waves in phase alignment, from front to back, right to left, you know, same as, similar to what someone who, a maven will say in neurofeedback would say that's their goal. You know, so.
I guess if I could offer just my 2 cents version, which is much less sophisticated. I think if you feel like you have to go in there and have special techniques, I think you're overlooking the fact that the most predictive factor in therapy, regardless of disorder, regardless of treatment modality, is the therapist and the therapeutic relationship. So if you want to talk about how to help somebody who is, say, overengaged or overstimulated, you can talk about having a good, solid relationship, good therapeutic rapport. I just ask them, is it hard to talk about this stuff? And they say yes, then I just say, okay, well, we'll work towards that. We should talk about it, but let's just take our time. And so